In the shadow-haunted hills of West Virginia, where the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers converge beneath the ancient peaks, a story of unparalleled darkness emerged in the year of our Lord 1896. This is the macabre tale of the Harpers Ferry sisters, whose culinary talents masked a far more sinister purpose. In a boarding house nestled along the cobblestone streets of that historic town, where John Brown once stirred the fires of rebellion, two sisters served more than mere sustenance to their unsuspecting guests. The hook is stark. What began as simple hospitality would transform into a web of poison and deception that would shock the entire region. To understand what follows, the setting matters. Harpers Ferry in 1896 was a town caught between its revolutionary past and an uncertain future. The great armory that had once produced weapons for a nation was now a shadow of its former self, and the town's economy relied heavily on small businesses and boarding houses that catered to the railroad workers and travelers passing through. It was here that sisters Evangeline and Cordelia Blackwood opened their establishment, the Riverside Boarding House, promising comfort and nourishment to weary travelers. The Blackwood sisters appeared to be the epitome of Victorian hospitality. Evangeline, the elder at 32, possessed an ethereal beauty that drew guests like moths to a flame. Her raven hair and piercing green eyes were matched only by her exceptional culinary skills, which she had honed in the kitchens of Baltimore's finest establishments. Cordelia, 28, was quieter but equally skilled, with an encyclopedic knowledge of herbs and spices that she claimed came from her grandmother's old country remedies. Together, they created a haven of warmth and good food that quickly became the talk of the town. What nobody knew was that beneath their charming exterior lay a calculating intelligence that had been shaped by years of hardship and a thirst for something far more complex than simple survival. The sisters had arrived in Harpers Ferry with little more than their cooking skills and a shared secret that would define their legacy in the most macabre way possible. They had discovered something in their grandmother's recipes that went far beyond flavor enhancement, a knowledge of substances that could be used to influence, control, and ultimately eliminate those who crossed their path. The boarding house itself was a 3-story Victorian structure with wraparound porches and gabled windows that seemed to peer out over the confluence of rivers like watchful eyes. Inside, the dining room was particularly impressive, with its hand-carved mahogany table that could seat 12 guests comfortably. The sisters took great pride in their evening meals, which featured elaborate dishes that combined traditional American fare with exotic spices and ingredients that were difficult to source. Guests often commented on the unique flavors, not realizing that each carefully prepared meal contained subtle additions that would alter their perceptions and, in time, their very lives. As autumn settled over the hills of West Virginia with its familiar cloak of gold and crimson, the Blackwood sisters had established themselves as prominent figures in Harpers Ferry society. Their boarding house was always full, with a waiting list of potential guests who had heard of their exceptional cuisine. The local newspaper, the Harpers Ferry Herald, had even featured them in an article titled "Culinary Wonders at the Riverside," praising their revolutionary approach to traditional American cooking. What the article failed to mention was the growing number of guests who, after staying at the boarding house, seemed to become increasingly dependent on the sisters' hospitality, returning again and again despite the mounting concerns of friends and family. If stories like this grip you, please like the video and subscribe so you don't miss what the records reveal next. The true nature of the Blackwood sisters' activities began to manifest in subtle ways during the early months of 1896. It started with what the townspeople described as strange behavior among some of their guests. Men and women who had stayed at the Riverside boarding house seemed to exhibit an unusual attachment to the establishment, often extending their stays well beyond their original plans. Harrison Wells, the town's physician, began noticing a pattern among his patients. Those who had lodged at the sisters' establishment complained of peculiar symptoms that defied conventional medical understanding. The first documented case involved Marcus Thornfield, a railroad inspector who had initially planned a 3-day stay in Harpers Ferry. By the end of his first week, Thornfield had extended his visit indefinitely, claiming that the exceptional care provided by the sisters had helped him recover from a persistent ailment that had plagued him for months. Dr. Wells noted that Thornfield appeared pale and gaunt, with dilated pupils and a peculiar tremor in his hands, yet he insisted that he had never felt better. When the doctor attempted to examine him more thoroughly, Thornfield became agitated and refused further medical attention, returning immediately to the comfort of the Riverside boarding house. As weeks passed, more cases emerged. Margaret Pemberton, a schoolteacher passing through town, found herself unable to leave despite receiving an urgent letter summoning her back to her hometown. She wrote to her sister that she felt addicted to the sister's cooking and that she was unwilling to taste any other food. Her letters became increasingly erratic, filled with elaborate descriptions of the meals she was consuming and an obsession with the Blackwood sisters' gift for nourishment. When her sister finally arrived to collect her, Margaret had to be physically removed from the boarding house, screaming about being starved if she left the sisters' care. The sisters themselves maintained their facade of perfect hospitality. Evangeline continued to charm the local merchants who supplied their kitchen, often receiving special deliveries of exotic ingredients that were difficult to obtain in rural West Virginia. Cordelia, meanwhile, spent long hours in the kitchen, experimenting with combinations of herbs and spices that she claimed were family recipes passed down through generations. The townspeople marveled at their dedication to their craft, unaware that these recipes were actually carefully calculated formulations designed to create dependency and control among their guests. What nobody knew was that the sisters had been systematically introducing mild psychoactive compounds into their meals, substances derived from nightshade, belladonna, and other plants that created a sense of euphoria followed by dependency. These compounds were carefully balanced to avoid immediate detection while creating a psychological and physiological attachment to the food. The sisters had learned these techniques from their grandmother, who had practiced what she called influential cooking in her native Transylvania before immigrating to America. The boarding house became a carefully orchestrated environment where the sisters could observe and manipulate their guests' behaviors. They kept detailed journals of each guest's reactions, preferences, and psychological responses to different formulations. Some guests were kept as long-term dependencies, while others served as test subjects for increasingly potent combinations. The sisters justified their actions as catering to their guests' needs, but in reality, they were conducting elaborate experiments in psychological and chemical control. By late spring of 1896, the Blackwood sisters had achieved a level of influence over their guests that bordered on the supernatural. Visitors spoke of dreams filled with the taste of the sisters' food, and many reported feeling physically ill when they attempted to leave. The local community began to whisper about the curse of the Riverside boarding house, though few dared to voice their concerns openly. The sisters' reputation continued to grow, drawing more travelers to Harpers Ferry, each one becoming another subject in their expanding web of culinary manipulation. If this careful middle chapter is earning your trust, please tap like and subscribe, small actions that let us keep telling long stories the patient way. The summer of 1896 brought with it a growing sense of unease to Harpers Ferry, though most residents could not articulate the source of their discomfort. The Blackwood sisters' boarding house continued to operate with apparent normalcy, its dining room filled with guests who seemed almost hypnotically devoted to the establishment. Dr. Harrison Wells, increasingly concerned about the pattern of unusual cases he had been seeing, began to investigate more systematically, though he could find no conventional medical explanation for the symptoms he observed. The situation reached a critical point when Thomas Whitmore, a wealthy merchant from Baltimore, arrived at the Riverside boarding house for what should have been a brief business visit. Within days of his arrival, Whitmore had canceled all his meetings and extended his stay indefinitely. His business associates grew alarmed when he failed to appear for important negotiations, and a telegram sent to him went unanswered. When his brother arrived in Harpers Ferry to retrieve him, he found Whitmore in a state of complete dependency, unwilling to leave the sisters' care, and insisting that he had discovered true happiness in their establishment. Dr. Wells finally obtained permission to examine Whitmore and discovered signs of chronic poisoning, dilated pupils, irregular heartbeat, and a peculiar chemical odor on his breath that reminded the physician of nightshade. When confronted with these findings, the Blackwood sisters remained calm and insisted that their guest was simply enjoying an extended period of rest and recuperation. They attributed his condition to the healing properties of their traditional recipes and the peaceful environment of their boarding house. Evangeline Blackwood, in particular, became more brazen in her approach during this period. She began to actively recruit new guests, sending letters to people she had met in nearby towns, inviting them to experience the restorative benefits of her cooking. These invitations were often accompanied by small samples of her special tea, which contained mild psychoactive compounds designed to create curiosity and a desire to experience more. Several recipients of these invitations found themselves inexplicably drawn to Harpers Ferry, arriving at the Riverside boarding house as if following an invisible thread. Cordelia's role evolved as well, becoming the keeper of increasingly complex formulations, She maintained detailed records of each guest's responses to different combinations of herbs and compounds, noting which guests could tolerate stronger doses and which required more subtle approaches. Her journal entries, written in a cipher that combined Romanian and Latin, described the guests not as people, but as experiments and subjects. She wrote of the satisfaction she felt when a new formulation achieved the desired effect, and of her plans to develop even more potent combinations. The boarding house itself began to take on an otherworldly quality. Guests who had been under the sisters' influence for extended periods moved through the establishment in a daze, their eyes often unfocused and their speech slow and deliberate. They performed small tasks around the property without being asked, as if responding to unspoken commands. The local grocer, Jacob Morrison, noted that these guests seemed to have no money of their own, and that the sisters paid for everything with cash that appeared to come from an endless supply. The horror that unfolded during this period was not immediately visible to the casual observer. The Blackwood sisters maintained the appearance of a successful and well-run establishment, with their meals continuing to receive praise from those who were not yet fully under their influence. However, Dr. Wells began to document a disturbing pattern. Guests who had stayed at the Riverside boarding house for more than 2 weeks showed signs of severe dependency, and those who attempted to leave often became gravely ill or experienced severe psychological distress. The sisters had perfected their method of control, creating a prison of chemical dependency disguised as hospitality. As autumn approached, the sisters' operation had evolved into something far more sinister than simple manipulation. They had begun to select certain guests for more permanent care, convincing them to transfer their assets to the boarding house in exchange for lifetime accommodation. These guests, now completely dependent on the sisters' formulations, signed documents without fully understanding the implications, effectively becoming the property of the Riverside boarding house. What had begun as subtle manipulation had transformed into a systematic operation that preyed upon vulnerable travelers and isolated individuals. The Riverside boarding house had become a trap of chemical dependency and psychological control, with the sisters selecting their victims with the precision of experienced predators. The first sign of trouble for the Blackwood sisters came in the form of Detective James Morrison, an investigator from the state capitol who had been following reports of missing persons throughout West Virginia. Morrison had noticed a pattern. Several individuals who had traveled through Harpers Ferry had simply vanished, their families receiving letters in their handwriting claiming they had found true peace at a boarding house in the town. The writing style in these letters was peculiar, overly formal and repetitive, as if the authors were constrained in their expression. Morrison's investigation led him to Dr. Harrison Wells, who had been documenting the strange cases in Harpers Ferry for months. The physician shared his concerns about the unusual symptoms he had observed in guests of the Riverside boarding house, though he admitted that he had no concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Together, they began to piece together a disturbing picture of systematic poisoning and psychological manipulation that extended far beyond what either had initially suspected. When Morrison attempted to interview the Blackwood sisters, he encountered their carefully cultivated charm and apparent innocence. Evangeline welcomed him warmly, offering him a meal prepared with the same attention to detail that had ensnared so many others. The detective, aware of the potential danger, declined her hospitality and focused on his investigation. He was permitted to tour the boarding house and speak with the remaining guests, though he quickly noticed that these individuals seemed to respond to subtle cues from the sisters rather than expressing independent thoughts. Cordelia, meanwhile, had been working on her most ambitious formulation yet, a compound that would create such profound dependency that guests would be unable to conceive of leaving the establishment. Her notes, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, spoke of her successes and her plans for expanding their operation. She wrote of the pleasure she derived from watching guests surrender their will, and of her vision of establishing a network of similar establishments throughout the region. The truth was far darker than anyone had imagined. The sisters had been systematically poisoning their guests over extended periods, creating a complex web of dependency that made escape nearly impossible. Those who managed to leave often experienced severe withdrawal symptoms that forced them to return to the Riverside boarding house for relief. The sisters had created a self-perpetuating system where their own poison became the antidote, making them the sole source of comfort for their victims. Dr. Wells and Detective Morrison began to suspect that some of the guests who had left the boarding house had actually met more permanent fates. The sisters spoke casually of guests who had moved on to better circumstances or had been reunited with family members, but no records could be found of these departures. Several missing person reports from other states mentioned individuals who had last been seen in Harpers Ferry, and all of them had connections to the Riverside boarding house. The horror that unfolded as the investigation deepened revealed the full scope of the sisters' operation. They had been using their boarding house as a front for what could only be described as a human harvesting operation, keeping guests dependent while slowly extracting their assets and eliminating those who became too difficult to control. The kitchen where they had once prepared meals for satisfied guests had become a laboratory for creating chemical chains of dependency and death. As winter approached and travel through Harpers Ferry decreased, the sisters began to feel the pressure of the investigation. They realized that their carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack, and they would need to take more drastic measures to protect their operation. The question that haunted Detective Morrison was how many victims had already fallen prey to their systematic exploitation, and how many more would be lost if their operation was not stopped immediately. The climax of the Blackwood sisters' reign of terror began on a frigid December morning in 1896, when Detective James Morrison returned to Harpers Ferry with a warrant to search the Riverside boarding house. The investigation had revealed a network of missing persons cases connected to the establishment, and Dr. Harrison Wells had finally been able to identify traces of belladonna and other toxic compounds in several former guests who had managed to escape the sisters' influence. Morrison arrived at the boarding house with 2 additional officers, only to find the establishment eerily quiet. The front door stood slightly ajar, and the familiar aroma of cooking that usually emanated from the kitchen was absent. As they entered, they discovered the remaining guests in a catatonic state, seated around the dining table as if frozen mid-meal. The sisters were nowhere to be found, but their private quarters revealed the full horror of their operation. The search of the sisters' rooms uncovered Cordelia's cipher journals, which detailed not only the chemical formulations used to control their guests, but also the systematic process of asset extraction and elimination of difficult subjects. The walls were covered with maps marking other potential locations for similar establishments, and financial records showed that the sisters had accumulated considerable wealth through their exploitation of vulnerable travelers. Most disturbing of all were the photographs of previous guests, many of whom had been reported missing in other states. In the basement of the boarding house, investigators discovered a makeshift laboratory where the sisters had been producing their psychoactive compounds. Shelves lined with bottles containing various herbs, powders, and tinctures filled the space, along with detailed notes on the effects of different combinations. The equipment suggested that the sisters had been operating this facility for years, perfecting their methods and expanding their operation. Evangeline and Cordelia Blackwood were eventually apprehended 2 days later at a train station in Martinsburg, attempting to flee to the West Coast with stolen funds. The sisters showed no remorse during their arrest, instead speaking in hushed conspiratorial tones about the work that must continue and the recipes that will survive. They had planned for this eventuality, leaving behind coded instructions for future operations hidden throughout the boarding house. The trial that followed became one of the most sensational cases in West Virginia history. The prosecution presented evidence of at least 17 confirmed victims, though investigators suspected the actual number was much higher. The defense attempted to argue that the sisters suffered from delusions of grandeur and a twisted sense of hospitality, but the evidence of systematic poisoning and financial exploitation was overwhelming. During the trial, former guests who had managed to break free from the sisters' influence testified about their experiences. They described the gradual loss of will, the inability to think clearly, and the desperate craving for the sisters' food that had kept them trapped. Many reported that even months after leaving the boarding house, they experienced cravings and psychological dependence that required extensive medical treatment. The horror that had unfolded in Harpers Ferry was finally brought to light, but not before revealing the extent to which the Blackwood sisters had perverted the concept of hospitality. Their service had been a carefully orchestrated system of chemical dependency and exploitation that preyed upon the vulnerable and isolated. Justice would come, but at a terrible price for all those who had fallen under their influence. As the case concluded, the Riverside boarding house was permanently closed, and the building was eventually demolished. However, the story of the sisters who served more than supper would live on as a cautionary tale about the dangers that could hide behind the most welcoming facade. The aftermath of the Blackwood sisters' capture sent shockwaves throughout West Virginia and beyond, as investigators worked to uncover the full extent of their criminal network. The sensational trial, which began in March of 1897, drew crowds from across the region, and became a defining case study in the emerging field of criminal psychology. The evidence presented revealed not just individual acts of poisoning, but a systematic operation that had been in development for years before their arrival in Harpers Ferry. Detective James Morrison's investigation continued long after the sisters' arrest, as authorities attempted to locate the missing individuals connected to the Riverside boarding house. The coded journals found in the sisters' quarters revealed a network of similar establishments across the eastern United States, though most appeared to be theoretical at this stage. The Blackwoods had been planning to expand their operations significantly, with detailed notes on how to replicate their methods in other locations. Dr. Harrison Wells, who had been instrumental in identifying the chemical compounds used by the sisters, testified extensively about the medical effects of the substances found in the boarding house laboratory. His testimony helped establish the long-term health consequences faced by the sisters' victims, many of whom continued to experience psychological and physical symptoms months after their exposure. The physician's involvement in the case marked a turning point in how medical professionals approached cases of suspected chemical manipulation. The financial investigation revealed the true scope of the sisters' exploitation. They had systematically extracted assets from their victims through various means, including forged documents, psychological manipulation, and in some cases the outright theft of personal property. The total amount stolen was estimated to be over $40,000, an enormous sum in 1896 that represented the life savings of dozens of travelers and merchants. Evangeline and Cordelia Blackwood's trial became a media sensation, with newspapers across the country covering the lurid details of their crimes. The defense team attempted to argue that the sisters suffered from mental illness, suggesting that their actions were the result of delusions about caring for people. However, the prosecution successfully demonstrated that the sisters had operated with clear intent and systematic planning, evidenced by their detailed financial records and expansion plans. The verdict came in May of 1897, after a 6-week trial that captivated the nation. Both sisters were found guilty on 17 counts of poisoning, 12 counts of theft, and 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. The judge sentenced them to life imprisonment with hard labor, noting in his remarks that their crimes represented a perversion of the most fundamental human kindness, the offering of food and shelter to those in need. The Riverside boarding house was permanently closed following the trial, and the building was eventually demolished in 1898. However, the location remained stigmatized, and several subsequent attempts to operate businesses on the site failed, with owners reporting strange occurrences and an uncomfortable atmosphere. The property remained vacant for decades, becoming a local landmark associated with the sisters' dark legacy. As the case faded from public attention, the impact on the victims and their families continued to be felt. Many of those who had been subjected to the sisters' chemical manipulation required long-term medical care, and some never fully recovered from the psychological effects of their experience. The case established important precedents for how law enforcement and medical professionals would approach similar situations in the future, leading to better recognition of chemical dependency and manipulation tactics. The story of the Blackwood sisters became a cautionary tale that warned travelers about the dangers of accepting hospitality from strangers, particularly in isolated locations. Their methods of using food as a delivery mechanism for psychoactive compounds represented a new type of criminal activity that law enforcement agencies would need to be vigilant against in the years to come. In the years following their conviction, the case became a cornerstone in the development of forensic toxicology, as medical examiners and law enforcement agencies worked to better understand and detect the types of chemical manipulation that the sisters had employed. The property where the Riverside boarding house once stood remained vacant for over 30 years, despite several attempts to develop the site. Local residents reported persistent feelings of unease and discomfort when near the location, and workers who attempted construction projects often abandoned their efforts, citing unexplained accidents and equipment failures. The land eventually became overgrown with wild vegetation, creating an eerie expanse that locals referred to as the Hungry Ground, a reference to the insatiable nature of the sisters' crimes. Dr. Harrison Wells dedicated much of his remaining career to studying the long-term effects of the chemical compounds used by the Blackwood sisters. His research, published in medical journals throughout the early 1900s, helped establish protocols for treating victims of similar chemical dependency schemes. Many of the former boarding house guests required ongoing medical care for the rest of their lives, as the psychoactive compounds had caused permanent changes to their neurological systems. Detective James Morrison's investigation techniques became a model for future cases involving isolated hospitality businesses. He advocated for increased vigilance regarding establishments that seemed to have unusually high rates of extended stays or guests who appeared overly dependent on the proprietors. His work led to the establishment of a registry for suspicious hospitality businesses and improved communication between law enforcement agencies regarding missing persons cases connected to boarding houses and hotels. The financial impact of the sisters' crimes rippled through the regional economy for years. Many of the stolen assets had represented the life savings of families and small business owners, creating economic hardship that extended far beyond the immediate victims. The state of West Virginia eventually established a victim compensation fund, though it took decades to locate and assist all of those who had been affected by the sisters' systematic exploitation. The case also influenced popular culture and literature, inspiring several novels and theatrical productions about deceptive hospitality and the dangers of blind trust. The story of the Blackwood sisters became a cautionary tale that was passed down through generations, warning travelers about the potential dangers of accepting extended hospitality from strangers, particularly in isolated locations. Modern criminologists continue to study the Blackwood sisters' case as an early example of systematic chemical manipulation for criminal purposes. Their methods of using food as a delivery mechanism for psychoactive compounds represented a sophisticated understanding of both chemistry and human psychology, making them pioneers of a particularly insidious form of criminal activity. The truth about what happened at the Riverside boarding house serves as a reminder of how the most basic human kindness, offering food and shelter to those in need, can be perverted into a tool of exploitation and control. The sisters' ability to exploit the very concept of hospitality made their crimes particularly heinous and their detection particularly difficult. Today, the story of the Harpers Ferry sisters who served more than supper remains a dark chapter in the history of West Virginia, a cautionary tale about the dangers that can hide behind the most welcoming facade. Their systematic approach to victim selection, chemical dependency creation, and asset extraction represents a level of premeditation and sophistication that was remarkable for its time. Listen closely. The macabre history of the Blackwood sisters reminds us that the most dangerous predators often hide behind the most innocent masks, using our trust and our basic needs against us in ways that can seem almost supernatural. Their legacy is a warning that continues to resonate more than a century after their capture, a testament to the enduring power of their particular brand of evil. Harrison Wells, who had at first chalked the fainting spells to vapors, started a notebook he did not show the sisters. He listed pupils dilated in daylight, heartbeats that ran quick then stumbled, mouths too dry for the weather, symptoms that sketched atropine's shadow more than fatigue. On a second page, he copied purchases from the general store ledger, flour and sugar in ordinary amounts, spices within reason, and then entries that bothered him, seeds and leaves rare for a boarding house, delivered in quantities that would outlast 7 winters. None of this was proof. All of it was enough to move his hand from doubt to inquiry. Wells borrowed a traveling chemist's kit, glass vials and droppers tucked like birds into straw, and performed the era's patient procedures. A tincture of belladonna yields no simple color change on command, the way arsenic's mirror declares itself. The work is inference and dose. He steeped crumbs, tested for alkaloids with reagents that darken and clear, watched for the faint ring on glass that means more than one plant was at play. His notes are careful where they must be, and silent where they should be. Compound admixture suspected, quantities impossible to fix without fresh specimen. The phrase is a doctor's way of refusing to pretend certainty. The sheriff, reluctant to turn hospitality into a crime scene, asked smarter questions as the winter lengthened. Who extends their stay and why? Who declines bread at the sisters' table and recovers? Who leaves and returns within a fortnight when they had intended to go on? The preacher, who had first praised the sisters' skill, reconsidered the ethical shape of feeding a town that no longer knew the line between gratitude and dependence. In his sermon book, a marginal note appears beside the text for a Sunday in November. Hospitality is not ownership. When the warrant finally arrived, it moved through the house with an awkward grace. Jars were counted, not spilled. Papers were read, not pocketed. The kitchen ledger, written in a tidy, rounded hand, listed menus and market days. Between those lines, fainter pencil notes spoke to another practice. E ate sparingly, increase. M sleeps now without complaint. H fearful at dusk, honey and tea. Care is not innocence. Observation is not guilt, but the accumulation admonished, even men inclined to leniency. A trap does not announce itself, it keeps a diary. In the cellar, the deputies found what every careful house keeps: crocks, hooks, a work table wiped to dullness, and one thing that did not fit: a chest with a false bottom, its wood planed just enough to sit flush and open easy. Inside lay letters never posted, requests for money to stay where I am mended, apologies to wives delayed by another week of cure, a promissory note payable to E.B. Blackwood. A map torn from a railroad timetable had a route circled to no destination at all. Each artifact could be given a kinder reading. Together they read themselves. Wells declined to perform in public. In his affidavit he named only processes and patterns. The sheriff's inventory named only objects and counts. The preacher wrote a letter to the council that used neither the word witch nor saint. Harpers Ferry began to practice a discipline that would keep the town intact when the headlines arrived. Declare what you can, refuse embroidery, and let arithmetic of days and doses do the talking. Courtrooms prefer binaries. Boarding houses are built from gradients. The trial that followed tried to compress months of dinners into neat charges the statute book could bear: adulterating food for gain, administering substances to impair judgment, false pretenses, and the soliciting of funds. The prosecutor, wary of turning the case into theater, kept to lines a jury could feel under their thumbs, receipts unmatched by menus, letters asking families for one more week that aligned too perfectly with market days, a physician's schedule that jibed with nights the sisters served their richest puddings. The defense argued charity. Guests arrived unwell and improved. Those who stayed did so freely. Herbs, they said, were a bitter language of care, not understood by men who measured only with scales. They called neighbors who had found relief in Cordelia's teas, merchants who had admired Evangeline's thrift. They invited the town to consider how easily a woman's competence can be renamed as cunning when fear looks for a hook. A few in the gallery nodded. More watched the kitchen ledger as if it might speak again. Verdict is a blunt instrument. It cannot apportion awe, regret, gratitude, and anger in proportions that satisfy. The court convicted on the count that carried the least spectacle and the most paper: obtaining funds by deception through the promise of cure. Sentences were practical. The sisters were separated. The house was shuttered under a supervision order. A fine was levied to repay those who could show letters and losses. The judge, who had seen enough hunger to know how dependence is made, added a line to his remarks that does not always survive in retellings: let this town learn to share its ailments before it outsources its relief. What changed afterward is the part that matters for those who come later. The boarding houses formed an association and adopted simple rules: plain ledgers inspected monthly by a council member, a limit on cures offered at table, a practice of referring the truly ailing to the doctor rather than doubling the dose. The church ladies rewrote their rota to include visits to travelers without kin. The storekeeper agreed to flag purchases of certain botanicals above household quantities, not to summon the sheriff, but to ask a neighborly question. These are not laws in the grand sense. They are guardrails placed where a dissent had been disguised as hospitality. For the record keepers, the docket holds the sentence, the inventory holds the objects, the letters hold the ache. For the storytellers, resist the neat label. The sisters were neither mythic villains nor misunderstood saints. They were skilled women who learned that in a hungry place a kitchen can become a pulpit and a lever. The town learned, slower than it should have, that gratitude can become a leash. Between those truths sits the lesson worth carrying, that care without consent is control, and that the line between the two must be drawn in public, not left to the cleverest hands in a private room. If careful, source-grounded work that privileges process over spectacle resonates with you. Like and subscribe. It helps us keep the lights on while we read ledgers and minutes, instead of rumors. Next time we return to the river and follow a gap in a ferry log to the edge of another story.